Hello and welcome to Humboldt Network of Family Resource Center's brief tour of our data system. In this video, we are going to discuss how HNFRC has gone about setting up a Google-based system to record our quarterly reporting across 16 sites, as well as our protective factor surveys, all the way from gathering the raw data to creating quarterly and annual reports. After this video, we are going to talk in the learning community about some of the lessons learned, some of the obstacles faced, some of the next steps, and then we'll be open to questions. Let's proceed. Before we dive in, some of the questions that are good to consider at the very earliest stages of putting together a new data system are, what are the reports you're going to build at the end? What will it look like? What are you trying to achieve? What kind of reports are you trying to draw? And this is a question that you really need to start addressing long before you lay the first brick with actually building the system, because based on the raw data that you gather, that's what you're limited by for everything from there. So our network, 16 sites, had questions around, well, maybe we want to be able to draw reports by an individual site. Maybe we want to be able to draw reports by a region of sites. And perhaps we want to be able to draw reports over a trend, meaning over time. These are questions that you want to integrate from the earliest stages into when surveys get entered, when quarterly reports are made, how you ask a couple questions in that report that may not be your typical required questions, but maybe things that help key in data later so that you can draw the specific reports that you may be looking for. So, taking those questions into consideration, how HNFRC proceeded is we found a common system that we could all gather around to use for our collective reporting. And that system turned out to be the Google Suite for Nonprofits. We have basically through G Suite for Nonprofits, I'm going to pull up the page there just so that you can find it later, a way to have more or less email addresses and a common Google Drive between all of our sites. So we have an email at hnfrc.org. What this does is this gives us, between 16 sites, organization level access to file sharing, to report tools that Google has. It lets you elevate beyond the tools where you have to make it so that anybody anywhere could log in anonymously and submit a report. We wanted something where you knew who logged in, you knew what the email address was that submitted the report, and you could do it in a secure fashion. And that's what we've put together here. We've also set up accounts that are not specific to any one person, but are instead specific to sites as a whole. So for example, instead of an account for Kim, it's an account for Blue Lake. And what that lets us do is it lets us have an account that survives any one coordinator or staff member. Okay, so we are ready to dive in. So for our system, we'll navigate to our drive in Google. And then just as a side note, HNFRC uses this Google Drive for more things than simply for reporting. We have, for example, our member resource library, where we put out printable materials, meeting minutes, ROI forms, you name it. It's just a great internal space in order to share things. But for today's presentation, we're going to focus on our reporting system. So every site will have access to this: HNFRC, DHHS, reporting, and PFS. Within this folder, we have a series of files. We've got, in these purple files, our quarterly report forms for CWS, CalWORKS, and our protective factors survey. We also have the responses for those folders or those forms, and we'll get back to those in a minute. I'm going to go ahead and open our protective factors survey. This survey acts as just a simple template where after a site has worked with the client to fill out a protective factor survey and gather demographic information, they can log in and enter their survey responses. And when we were talking a little earlier about what are some of these building block pieces that you really need to gather in order to make sure that your system is robust, these are those questions. Which site are you with? We can figure out which site. And you can see that, for example, Arcata, that's our site, is also a member of HNFRC. I use that as a meta tag so that we can draw a report for all of us later. And we've also tagged in their region. That way, if the sites want to draw it by region, they can. We can answer questions as a pre or post survey. What date was the survey completed? One of the great things about this is, although a standard Google Forms survey gives you a timestamp when you submit it, maybe the survey was done a month ago, and we just now got to the time where we were able to enter a block of surveys. This allows the respondent to enter the survey when flexible for their time. How was the survey completed? the language the survey was issued in. When you're working with an evidence-based tool, it can help you to know some of the different versions or variations of a survey that you've used. A unique code. So rather than trying to get really technical around having every site subscribe to this specific set of coding, we said a simple thing. We said set up a code system at each of your 16 sites that works for you, that doesn't identify your client, but that you're able to tie back any survey response to the person that you issued it to, and then use that code system. So as long as a site said, for example, JFRC 001 did a pre-survey, and then I go back in later and I say that JFRC 002 did a post-survey, this system that we've built will be able to tie those two together and match them for an outcomes report. We get into our demographic information. The way that we've set up our system for the protective factors survey is to make all of these questions optional. Again, if you make too many questions required, you may end up having people not submit a survey because it was a little bit incomplete. In the back end, the protective factor survey has sub-scoring tools to make sure that if you didn't answer enough questions in one protective factor section, it's not going to record the response. Be really careful about how many things you make required and how many things you make optional. The things at the top are all required here. These are these red asterisks. But once we get into the actual questions of the survey, it's optional. It's gather what you can. So we'll move along here. We've got questions around ethnographics, income, residence, zip code, education level, household income, you name it. Now we get into the actual survey questions themselves, and people will click through. It's a simple survey. And what we found is that with this tool through Google Forms, it's been easy to train staff, A-Factor AmeriCorps members, anybody coming into their job pretty quickly. It's a tool that they might have used before for a class or a workshop to fill out a survey. And so we wanted something simple, something that we could edit, something that we could train people really quickly on. That's been integral in making this system work fluently. So when somebody's filled out their survey, they'll go to the bottom and they'll hit submit. And a couple things happen. Instantly, that response gets sent into our Google Sheets, which is an Excel spreadsheet type form. And that's going to be, again, on the back end here. So I'm back in our drive, and I go to our protective factor survey responses. And those responses, once you submit the survey, get recorded, time-stamped, who submitted it, and then all the answers along. This is the raw data, and the really important piece here is that you want to gather your raw data in a place where people can access it, any site if they need to, but where they can't edit it. You really want to protect this like Fort Knox. We've gathered our raw data, and that's a really important piece. I think if your organization is considering kind of a low-tech way to collect data across multiple sites or across a bunch of different people, if you can get to the point where you have a common form to submit the survey so that you have uniform answers, and where you have a way to gather all the raw data in one place, you've accomplished 80% of the battle. From here, it's just a matter of having somebody go in and format this data into a meaningful report. So at this point, this is where we get to the more technical pieces. And from here, when you start to build the actual calculations around the raw data, the formatting of the data, the building of the report, this is where you start to need to look within your organization and say, do I have technically savvy folks? Do I have some people who can really commit some time and some spreadsheet expertise to this? If I do, great. And this next step is for you. If you don't, this is a good time to maybe reach beyond your organization. This could be something where you bring in an external consultant for a little while, where you end up just gathering the raw data and then using one of the offline tools that Protective Factor Surveys has provided. And we can talk more about an access-based system that they've put out later. But from here, start thinking about how much time can I commit to the technical side of things. What we're going to do is we're going to show you a little bit about what we did here. So from this raw data, we've had other forms that will pull that data like a window and then format it into the reports that we're looking to build. So I'm going to go into our data cruncher here for the Protective Factor Survey. It's just another spreadsheet. And again, this sheet will pull that raw data without editing it, and we'll just bring it into a new sheet where we can actually kind of manipulate it and work with it. So on the first page here, it's a report. It's pretty simple. If I was to go in and draw a report for HNFRC, I'm going to click three things here. I'm going to click a drop down and pick which site I want. Do I want the network as a whole or just a site? Again, we're going to add tools in later because we're a work in progress here to do things like regions and trends over time. But for right now, we're keeping it simple. So I've got HNFRC selected. I've got a report ending date, and I've got a report beginning date. So what that means is I'm going to pick up whichever surveys were identified as having been taken between July 1st, 2018, December 31st, 2018. From there, you're going to get queried data. And again, that means you filter that data down to just the things that meet those criteria. So in this case, all sites work, but only reports within those time parameters. Now, again, this is where your technical expertise comes in. So if you can look at the top here, it's kind of small text. This is where you start to get into the large formulas. It's not rocket science. It's not going to take somebody an infinite amount of time to do it. I think somebody who can dedicate some time to this, even a lay person, can probably figure out most of these. A lot of it's adding, getting an average, you name it. But again, you start to crunch the data. Ultimately, after you've been able to crunch it, make the calculations you want, format it into table data, we can start to draw reports and graphs. And so this is what we've put together. Again, quite simple. We're able to gather our raw counts for our PFS responses across the different subscale scores at entry and at post. We haven't actually used this specific graph in our report. We didn't like it. It was a little noisy. But some of the ones that we have liked, and I'll get down to those, are, for example, this report. So here we go, a nice, simple, crisp across the 5 protective factors: family resiliency, social support, concrete support, nurturing and attachment, and then there's 5 other questions in parenting skills and child development that are broken out. We have in our dark blue or purple here, the average response score for a pre-survey, and in our yellow, the average response score for a post-survey. And you can see that across most of our domains, we're seeing some improvement. Across some, we see a little bit of backslide. And this is where you can put it right into a report and then start to drill down and say, hey, who are taking these surveys? What's going on here? How can we respond to that? So this is not just a piece to make beautiful reports. It's a piece to really start thinking about your work, really start to know what your outcomes look like. How are the programs that you're implementing affecting families? And again, one of the things that we have to think about is, hey, we have 16 sites. And across 16 sites and all of our various programs, we can kind of look at a geographic, regional trend in protective factors and how those outcomes look. But one of the things that this system can do is drill down to a specific site in a specific time frame. So let's say that Arcata set up a new parenting course between July and April of the next year. And they want to look at specifically nurturing and attachment and parenting skills and child development. Within that time frame, they could draw a report for just their site and just the surveys done within that window, and they can really drill down to see precisely how their program is affecting those resiliency factors. So that's one of the flexibilities of this tool, and one of the things that can make it really powerful is that it can work for one site in particular. It can work for drill downs, you name it. We've also gathered our demographics here. Again, it doesn't take too much to just take some of those basic demographic responses and turn them into charts, pie graphs, bar graphs, you name it. Now, the nice thing here is all of this is real time. So if a new survey were entered in this realm right now, in about 30 seconds after somebody hits submit and it kind of churns through, my reports here are going to update within that time frame. So what we're able to do is we don't have to keep rebuilding graphs month after month. All I have to do is enter a new query on our report page, either pick a different site or pick new dates, and it's going to churn through and it'll pull the exact report for that, build the graphs, and at this point, it's just copy and paste it into a report. So it's really sped up our reporting process and really simplified some of that kind of laborious data crunching and graph building that we have to do. I guess that I could say we no longer have to do. So from here, the question that may remain is, okay, so you built a system on your own. You gathered your data, you put it in one place, you formatted it. It looks like you've built it correctly, but is it pretty? Does it actually communicate a good story? Is it something of value to your sites, to your funders, to your community? It's a good question. Our answer to that has been yes. And we're going to show you the report that we've built. This is our first ever protective factor survey report by HNFRC to our funders. And we started with a 75-page report that we've done in years past in our mid-year and annual reports, full of text, tough to digest. We had a funder admit, hey, I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't even read much of it. So we said, okay, let's do something different this year. We're down to our report being about 20 pages. It's loaded with infographics. It's really communicated the data well. We heard back just glowing response from our funders and our community partners that this looks great. We learned from it. We read it. We're excited. Let's move from here. So here's the report. It's got a little bit of information about our protective factors. We go into the basics on what our surveys were in the reporting period for our first draw. There's that graph that we looked at a little bit earlier where we're able to communicate the pre and post scoring. We have our outcomes mapped out here. So in blue, the total number of outcomes that were measured. Here, the number that improved their resiliency factor in that domain, the number that remained the same, and the number that had backslide. And again, that's a report that you drill down into and you start to learn what's working well, what's kind of a wash, and what can we improve upon. And then within the demographics, from those questions that the respondents answered, we've input them here. And one of the things that we're working on right now is to start to compare the data that we gather internally to outside empirical data. So for example, county ethnographic data, or CalFresh data that the state puts out, or labor statistics data, you name it. And so that's kind of the next step here for us, is to start to really tie what we're gathering internally in data and looking at how it pairs up with other outside data. So that's it for our presentation. And if you have any questions for us, you're welcome to get in touch with Amy DeBay or myself, Mark Weller, and we're happy to follow up with you. We look forward to talking next with strategies about some of the lessons learned here and some of the next steps for our network. Thank you very much.